Imagine standing in a crowded market in Ouagadougou. On one side sits a bag of imported rice, polished, familiar, and shipped from thousands of miles away. Just a few steps beside it rests another bag, harvested by a farmer from Burkina Faso after months of working under the scorching African sun. To most shoppers, they look almost identical, but to an entire nation, they represent two completely different futures. On April 29, 2026, Burkina Faso made a decision that surprised traders, caught exporters off guard, and immediately sparked debate across agricultural markets. The government suspended rice imports, choosing to encourage the consumption of locally produced rice instead. At first glance, it sounded like a simple trade policy, but beneath that announcement lies a much bigger question. Was this really about rice, or was it the first move in an economic strategy designed to rebuild an entire nation from the ground up? At a time when many parts of the world continue struggling with trade uncertainty, rising production costs, and pressure on domestic farmers, Burkina Faso chose a different path. It accepted short-term uncertainty in pursuit of greater food security and stronger local agriculture. That decision created clear winners, clear losers, and perhaps an entirely new conversation about Africa's economic future. If you enjoy thoughtful African news and deeper economic analysis beyond the headlines, subscribe now and join us for every step of this remarkable journey. Because before this story ends, you'll discover why one ordinary grain of rice may become one of the most powerful symbols of Africa's search for economic independence. But was this only the beginning of something far greater than anyone expected? On the morning of April 29, 2026, something unusual happened in Burkina Faso's agricultural sector. The government announced the temporary suspension of rice imports, explaining that the measure was intended to encourage the consumption of locally produced rice and strengthen the country's domestic agricultural economy. For many people outside Africa, it sounded like just another trade policy. But inside Burkina Faso, everyone understood that the decision carried much greater weight. It was not simply about reducing imports. It was about changing decades of economic habits. For years, imported rice had become a familiar sight in local markets. It was often viewed as the easier choice, even while thousands of local farmers struggled to sell their own harvests at sustainable prices. Every truck carrying imported rice into the country also represented money flowing back out of the national economy. Every unsold bag of locally grown rice represented another family wondering whether farming still had a future. The government was betting that protecting local demand today could encourage greater production tomorrow. It was a calculated risk, because no policy of this scale comes without challenges. Traders worried about disrupted supply chains. Import businesses faced uncertainty. Some consumers questioned whether local production could immediately meet demand. Others wondered whether prices might rise before harvests expanded. Those concerns were real, and they became part of the national conversation almost overnight. Now imagine a farmer named Issa living on the outskirts of Bama. Last season, he harvested enough rice to support his family. Yet week after week, buyers chose cheaper imported rice instead. His storage shed remained full while his savings slowly disappeared. His oldest son quietly began talking about leaving the village to search for work in the city. His neighbors wondered whether rice farming still made economic sense. Then came the government's announcement. Suddenly, local cooperatives began receiving more inquiries. Rice mills started preparing for higher demand. Agricultural officers returned to farming communities with renewed discussions about improving irrigation, storage facilities, and production techniques. Nothing changed overnight. Issa did not become wealthy the next morning. But for the first time in years, he believed that the next harvest might finally have a guaranteed market inside his own country. Sometimes, economic transformation begins long before statistics change. It begins when people regain the confidence to invest in tomorrow. Yet this decision was never guaranteed to succeed. If domestic production failed to expand quickly enough, shortages could emerge. If prices increased too rapidly, public support might weaken. The government would need more than a temporary import suspension. It would need better irrigation systems, improved seeds, stronger transportation networks, modern storage facilities, efficient rice mills, and continued cooperation between farmers, businesses, and consumers. In other words, the suspension itself was not the destination. It was only the first move in a much larger strategy to rebuild an agricultural value chain capable of feeding Burkina Faso with its own production. And that raises an even more important question. What happens when farmers begin believing that their own country is finally investing in their future instead of relying on food produced somewhere else? The answer may reach far beyond a single harvest, and perhaps even far beyond Burkina Faso itself. A few weeks after the policy was announced, the first signs of change did not appear in government offices. They appeared in places that rarely make international headlines. They appeared in village markets before sunrise. They appeared beside irrigation canals, where farmers gathered to discuss the coming season. They appeared inside small rice mills that had spent years operating below capacity, waiting for customers who never seemed to come. The suspension of imports did not instantly transform Burkina Faso's agricultural sector, but it changed something just as important. It changed expectations. For the first time in many years, thousands of farming families began asking a different question. Instead of wondering whether they should abandon their fields, they began asking how much more they could produce next season. That shift in confidence may be impossible to measure in a single economic report, but history has shown that confidence is often the first harvest before prosperity ever arrives. Across farming communities, cooperative leaders started organizing meetings with renewed energy. Agricultural advisors spoke not only about planting techniques, but about long-term planning. Local mill operators began preparing equipment that had remained idle during previous seasons. Warehouse owners explored ways to expand storage capacity before the next harvest. Transport companies quietly calculated how many additional trucks might soon be needed to move locally produced rice instead of unloading imported shipments at distribution centers. One policy decision was beginning to influence dozens of other economic activities. The value of a single grain of rice was no longer measured only by the price paid at the market. It was becoming part of a much larger economic chain that connected farmers, mechanics, truck drivers, warehouse workers, mill operators, shopkeepers, and families across the country. Imagine a young entrepreneur named Awa. For years, she watched imported rice dominate local shelves, while her family's small milling business struggled to survive. Modern equipment seemed like an impossible investment because there was never enough predictable demand. But after the government's announcement, local cooperatives began calling instead of waiting. Farmers wanted to know how quickly their harvests could be processed. Local retailers asked whether consistent supplies would be available throughout the year. Banks that had previously shown little interest in agricultural processing started listening more carefully to business proposals connected to domestic food production. Awa still faced enormous challenges. Financing remained difficult. Infrastructure still required improvement. Electricity costs still mattered. But for the first time, expanding her business no longer felt like a gamble against impossible odds. It felt like participating in a national effort to strengthen local agriculture from the ground up. The change was also visible in conversations between generations. Older farmers shared techniques developed over decades of experience. Younger people who once believed that opportunity existed only in distant cities began reconsidering the future of agriculture. Parents who had encouraged their children to leave farming started asking whether modern equipment, improved irrigation, and stronger domestic demand could finally make agriculture profitable again. No one claimed the journey would be easy. Weather would remain unpredictable. Investment would still be necessary. Productivity would have to improve. But the conversation itself had changed. Hope was replacing resignation, and that alone represented a remarkable shift. Beyond individual villages, the decision carried a message that reached far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Many African countries have long discussed food security, value addition, and reducing dependence on imported staples. Burkina Faso's policy added another example to that conversation. Supporters viewed it as an attempt to strengthen domestic production and keep more agricultural value within the country. Critics questioned whether local supply could grow quickly enough to meet demand and warned that careful implementation would be essential. Both perspectives highlighted an important reality. Success would depend not only on restricting imports, but also on sustained investment in farmers, infrastructure, processing, and logistics. Perhaps that is why this story captured attention far beyond the rice fields themselves. It was never simply about replacing one bag of rice with another. It was about asking whether confidence, production, and long-term planning could become the foundation of a more resilient agricultural economy. If that foundation continues to grow stronger, today's decision may eventually be remembered as more than a temporary trade measure. It may be remembered as the moment when Burkina Faso began treating agriculture not as a sector that needed protection forever, but as one capable of creating lasting opportunity for future generations. But if one decision can restore confidence to farmers across a nation, what could happen if that confidence is matched by better infrastructure, smarter investment, and a long-term vision for economic self-reliance? That is where this story becomes even more compelling. By now, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. The suspension of rice imports was never intended to be the final destination. It was only the opening move. Because producing more rice means very little if that rice cannot be stored, processed, transported, financed, and sold efficiently. That is where the real economic transformation begins. A single harvest can feed a family, but an entire agricultural value chain can help support communities, create businesses, and strengthen long-term resilience. This is the difference between simply growing food and building an economy around it. For decades, many African countries have exported raw materials while importing finished products, including food. The result has often been familiar. Farmers worked hard, yet much of the value was created somewhere else. Burkina Faso's latest policy signaled an ambition to capture more of that value at home. Every additional warehouse reduces post-harvest losses. Every modern rice mill allows farmers to sell a higher value product instead of raw grain. Every improved irrigation system increases the chance that one successful harvest can be followed by another. Every new storage facility gives producers more flexibility instead of forcing immediate sales during peak harvest season when prices are often lowest. Suddenly, agriculture is no longer only about planting and harvesting. It becomes an interconnected economic system where each improvement strengthens the next. That is why economists often speak about multipliers rather than individual policies. When a farmer earns a better income, that money does not stop at the farm gate. It pays local mechanics to repair equipment. It supports shop owners in nearby towns. It allows parents to invest in education. It creates demand for transport services, construction, packaging, financial services, and local manufacturing. One successful agricultural season begins circulating income throughout an entire community. The impact extends far beyond the field itself. Instead of one industry growing alone, several industries begin moving forward together. Imagine a mother walking through a neighborhood market a year from now. Instead of finding only imported products, she notices more bags labeled "Produced in Burkina Faso." She recognizes the names of nearby farming cooperatives. The rice on the shelf represents more than food. It represents local employment, local businesses, and local investment. She knows that purchasing one bag helps support families who live only a few hours away instead of sending most of that economic value beyond the country's borders. For many consumers, that realization changes the meaning of an ordinary shopping trip. Every purchase becomes a small investment in the country's own productive capacity. Of course, none of this happens automatically. Strong policies must be followed by consistent implementation. Farmers need access to quality seeds, modern equipment, affordable financing, reliable roads, electricity, irrigation, and technical support. Consumers expect stable prices and dependable supplies. Businesses need confidence that long-term investments will be rewarded by a predictable market. Without those foundations, even the most ambitious policy can struggle. That is why the real measure of success will not be the announcement itself. It will be whether Burkina Faso can steadily improve productivity while maintaining affordability for families and creating sustainable opportunities for producers. This broader strategy also arrives at a moment when many countries are reassessing the resilience of their own food systems. Recent years have shown how global supply chains can face unexpected disruptions, whether from geopolitical tensions, climate events, or changing trade conditions. Around the world, governments have begun discussing how to strengthen domestic production and reduce vulnerabilities. Burkina Faso's decision reflects one version of that broader conversation, placing greater emphasis on local agricultural capacity while accepting that the transition may involve both opportunities and challenges. Perhaps the most remarkable part of this story is that it shifts the national conversation from dependence to capability. Instead of asking how much food can be purchased abroad, the question becomes how much can be produced, processed, and improved at home. That difference may appear small in a policy document, but it represents a profound change in economic thinking. It replaces short-term transactions with long-term investment. It encourages patience instead of quick fixes, and it reminds an entire generation that lasting prosperity is rarely imported. More often, it is built one field, one business, and one community at a time. But if Burkina Faso succeeds in strengthening its agricultural value chain, another question naturally follows. Will neighboring countries see this as an isolated experiment, or could it become part of a much larger movement toward greater food security and economic resilience across Africa? That answer may shape not only the future of Burkina Faso, but also the future direction of agricultural development across the region. As Burkina Faso's decision began attracting attention beyond its borders, an even larger question emerged. Could this become more than a national policy? Could it represent part of a wider conversation taking place across Africa about food security, domestic production, and economic resilience? That question matters because the global economy is changing. Supply chains have become less predictable. Trade relationships continue to evolve. Many governments are reassessing how much they should rely on imported essentials and how much they should be able to produce at home. Burkina Faso's rice policy entered that discussion at a moment when food security had become a strategic issue, not simply an agricultural one. For decades, international trade has connected producers and consumers across continents, creating enormous benefits while also exposing countries to external shocks when markets become unstable. Burkina Faso's decision illustrates one possible response to those vulnerabilities. Supporters argue that stronger domestic agriculture can improve resilience, create employment, and retain more economic value inside the country. Others point out that long-term success will depend on maintaining productivity, affordability, and efficient markets rather than relying on import restrictions alone. In reality, both observations highlight the same truth. Sustainable agricultural development requires far more than one policy. It requires consistent investment, effective institutions, and the confidence of farmers, businesses, and consumers working toward the same objective. Across West Africa, governments continue exploring different approaches to strengthen agricultural production, expand regional trade, and improve food security. If local production increases while regional infrastructure improves, neighboring countries may discover new opportunities to exchange agricultural products within the region rather than depending entirely on distant suppliers. Such developments could strengthen economic cooperation while also reducing transportation costs and increasing market stability. Whether that vision becomes reality will depend on practical implementation rather than political speeches alone. Beyond Africa, policymakers, economists, and international businesses are likely to observe developments with interest. Every country has a legitimate interest in understanding how changes in agricultural policy influence production, prices, investment, and regional trade. For exporters, shifts in demand may encourage adjustments in strategy. For investors, expanding domestic agricultural industries can create new opportunities in irrigation, storage, logistics, food processing, and technology. For development institutions, Burkina Faso's experience may provide another case study in balancing domestic production goals with open markets and consumer affordability. Perhaps the most important lesson extends beyond economics. Nations that invest in their ability to feed their own people often strengthen more than food production. They strengthen confidence. They encourage innovation. They create reasons for young entrepreneurs to build businesses at home instead of searching for opportunities elsewhere. A modern rice mill employs engineers. Irrigation systems require technicians. Warehouses create logistics jobs. Financial services expand alongside agricultural investment. What begins with farming gradually supports an entire network of industries connected by one common objective: creating more value inside the country before value leaves it. That is why this story resonates far beyond one harvest season. It invites a broader discussion about how countries can balance international trade with domestic capacity and how agriculture can become part of a long-term development strategy rather than only a response to short-term shortages. Burkina Faso has taken one step along that path. Whether the results fully match the ambition will depend on years of careful implementation, continued investment, and the ability to adapt when challenges appear. And that brings us to the final and perhaps most important question. If this policy becomes only the first chapter of a larger transformation, what kind of Burkina Faso could emerge 10 years from now? More importantly, what lessons might the rest of Africa draw from that journey, whether its outcomes exceed expectations or reveal new challenges along the way? History rarely changes in a single day. More often, it changes through a series of quiet decisions that, at first, seem almost ordinary. A farmer plants one more field. A family chooses a locally grown product. A business invests in a new rice mill. A government decides to strengthen domestic production instead of relying only on imported supply. Standing alone, each decision may appear small, but together, they can gradually reshape the future of a nation. At the beginning of this story, we asked a simple question. Was Burkina Faso's decision really about rice? By now, the answer may be much clearer. Rice was never the destination. Rice became the symbol, a symbol of confidence, a symbol of self-reliance, and perhaps most importantly, a symbol of a country choosing to invest in its own people before depending on others to feed them. That does not mean the road ahead will be easy. Every ambitious reform brings risks. Weather can change. Markets can fluctuate. Infrastructure takes years to build. Farmers need continued support. Businesses need confidence to invest, and consumers need affordable food. No single policy can solve every challenge overnight, but history reminds us that every lasting transformation begins with the courage to take the first responsible step, then the discipline to keep moving forward. From my perspective, this may be the most important lesson hidden inside this story. The true strength of Burkina Faso's decision is not whether it immediately changes every economic indicator. Its greatest strength is that it encourages a different way of thinking. Instead of asking, "What can we import next?" the conversation becomes, "What can we produce together?" Instead of measuring success only by today's prices, people begin thinking about the opportunities that future harvests, stronger local industries, and better infrastructure might create for the next generation. That shift in mindset is often where real development begins. If Burkina Faso continues investing in irrigation, modern farming techniques, storage facilities, food processing, transportation, education, and the people working every day across its agricultural sector, then today's decision may one day be remembered as the beginning of something much larger than a temporary trade policy. It could become one chapter in a longer story about building a more resilient economy, creating more opportunities at home, and inspiring confidence that progress can be achieved through patience, hard work, and cooperation. Perhaps that is why this story resonates with so many people across Africa. It is not because every country should make the same policy choices. Every nation faces different circumstances and must decide its own path. It is because the underlying idea is universal. A nation grows stronger when its people believe that their own effort can shape a better future. That belief cannot be imported. It must be built, protected, and passed from one generation to the next. So, when we return to the 2 bags of rice we saw at the very beginning of this video, they no longer look the same. One represents a product. The other represents a possibility. A possibility that Burkina Faso can strengthen its agricultural foundation, create greater opportunities for its farmers, and contribute to a more confident and resilient future for Africa. May God bless Africa. May God bless Burkina Faso. May God grant wisdom and protection to Ibrahim Traore, to the farmers working from sunrise to sunset, and to everyone who supports peace, justice, dignity, and the hope of a stronger future for the African continent. Now, we would love to hear your perspective. Do you believe this decision could become a turning point for Burkina Faso's agricultural economy, or do you see important challenges that still need to be overcome? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. Your ideas, your experience, and your perspective may inspire someone else to see this story from a different angle. And if this journey gave you a deeper understanding of Burkina Faso's future, please support the channel by liking this video, subscribing for more thoughtful African news and economic analysis, and sharing it with someone who believes that hope, hard work, and determination can still change the course of history. Until next time, thank you for watching, and may God continue to bless Africa and all those who work for justice, peace, and a brighter tomorrow.